All right, let's talk a little bit more about the China Plus One strategy and where India stands in the larger scheme of things. My guest today is Anjani Kumar, who is partner at Deloitte. Anjani, thank you so much for taking the time. You've studied this in some detail. You've spoken with companies from around the world. You've got insight into what these business leaders are thinking. So my first question to you is, can it be said that India currently stands at the front of the line of countries that could benefit from China Plus One?
So thanks for inviting me to the show, Alex, and a very good evening to you and viewers. Let me take that question in two parts. One is the size of the opportunity per se, and where does India stack up with respect to capitalizing on the opportunity. I think the opportunity per se is fairly large. When we've done an analysis and looked at about $2.5 trillion worth of exports of China and what part of it can India actually have a meaningful role in, we looked at multiple sectors which contribute to this 2.5 trillion exports of China, and we found out that there are about 8 to 10 sectors where India has at least a 1 to 2% say already in the global trade or global exports, and hence there is a meaningful play for India in those sectors. And when I add up those sectors, it's about a 1.7 trillion opportunity, or it's a play for India. Coming to the second question, how realistic is it? And if you ask me, is India the first country that organizations look at when companies are thinking of China Plus One strategy? The answer clearly is no. They are looking at India is definitely in the consideration set, but it's not yet in the forefront, and not necessarily the first country that organizations look at when they're thinking of China Plus One.
So in a sense, it's been said, Anjani, and in conversations that ET Now has had not too long back also, is that there are issues in terms of the relatively higher cost of labor, land, logistics. Is that the reason why India is down the pecking order?
So, Alex, I think those are important contributing reasons for sure. But recently, when we've spoken to about 1,200 executives of MNCs across 4 countries, which are the largest contributors of FDI to India, while those reasons came across as important, I think what was the single largest prohibitor of making investments is the lack of what they said institutional stability. So that translated in terms of clarity in regulatory reforms, tax regulation, judicial redressal mechanisms. So that came across as a more important aspect, which is preventing some of these companies from investing in India. I think the other important aspect that came across as a result of this conversation is there is a fairly sharp divide across countries. So when we spoke to executives in US and UK, the propensity to invest was far higher than some of the Asian countries like Japan and Singapore. So there's almost a divide in that sense. And I think one of the things that we as business stakeholders will have to do is go out there and share some of the changes that the government has done, some of the reforms that have been brought in to make sure that these are well understood by investors, which I believe has a direct correlation to increasing their propensity to invest in India.
Okay, you mentioned about 8 sectors that can benefit significantly. Could you talk about some of the key measures that have been taken in the recent past and that could be communicated, that could see immediate movement on the ground, Anjani?
Absolutely. In fact, what we did was, as part of our discussions with the MNC executives, we actually ran them through some of these changes and some of these reforms that the government has initiated. And the moment they understood more about these reforms, their willingness to invest increased significantly. And some of these changes are things like digitization of customs clearances, the PLI schemes, the easing of regulations in FDI across sectors, the Atmanirbhar scheme, the Made in India scheme, the bankruptcy laws that the Indian government has enacted, the reduction in taxation for some of the MNCs, the investments in infrastructure that the government has done. So if you look at some of these reforms and some of the schemes that are being rolled out by the government, when communicated and discussed with the executives, clearly had a positive correlation with their willingness to invest in India.
Okay. So definitely that's something that could pan out over the next few years at least, one would think. But I'm just trying to get a sense from you, these sectors that you've mentioned, I want to understand which they are. So I would think that chemicals would come in, pharmaceutical would definitely come in. So what would those sectors, key sectors be to watch?
Yeah, I think, so one of the things that we looked at is if you look at almost do a sector by sector analysis and look at sectors where India today has anywhere between 2 to 3% or higher share of global trade. And you're right, pharmaceuticals is one, chemicals and API is another, textiles is a third, food processing is a fourth. If you look at some of these sectors, clearly there is a distinction in the ability of India to attract significantly higher capital in these sectors because one, they're province sectors. Secondly, there is an ecosystem that is existent in India. And thirdly, the government has been rolling out schemes, whether it's around SEZs, whether it's PLI schemes, focused on these sectors, which allow for these sectors to almost become a magnet for attracting significant amount of investments, which are not just for satiating the domestic demand, but also for organizations to use India as an export hub for these sectors. So I think, to my mind, it's almost a sector play, and the other variable is a country play. As I said, some countries, we've clearly had longer-term relationships. They've been investing in India for much longer. So as we look at an interplay of sector and countries, clearly looking at specific opportunities, specific organizations, getting them into India as anchor investors, and then growing the sector and making that sector an export hub for India is clearly what is eminently possible over the next few years.
All right, and certainly I'm going to end this conversation on that note because that's certainly something to build towards, Anjani, something to hope for, and that's a positive note to end the program on. It's been an absolute pleasure to speaking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Alex.
On that note, that brings us to the end of this edition of Spotlight. Thank you so much for watching. This is ET Now.